which have generated many of the inconsistent functions disloyal to the hierarchy generated in the Republic, where they directly ignore direct orders from their superior officers, such as Dr. Fauci doing gain of function research against the direct order of President Obama, and many other of these types of examples where they actively engage in subversions to the use of orders while at the same time hypocritically switching it into the function where they derive their protection by the action of claiming that they are following orders, at which point you have the double-minded presumption, which is generated by plausible deniability. Now, these constructs generated as a separation of orders separate to the hierarchy generates their ability to engage in the excuse to assassinations of their superior officers in acts of treason, sedition, and high crimes, which is fundamental to the War on David, which is actively been leveraged into the assassination attempts in the Manchurian candidates, such as their assassination attempt of several of the presidents, such as Ronald Reagan, JFK, and some other leaders which have actively been put into these intentionally malicious positions for being subversive to the duplicitous nature of not following the hierarchy of their direct orders, so that when other countries complain about actions projected to come from the United States equipment, then it would be able to come back to them, but it is subversive by their plausible deniability automated functions, which subverts and detracts away from the constitutional obligation of hierarchy, such as the commander-in-chief being the supreme leader over the executive, but not the total government, in the three equal branches of government, which are actively subverted by the engagements of these insurrections in systematic tampering with the system, such as the use of the legislator contracting to the executive the function of legislation, which is specifically prohibited, which they were supposed to be jealous over the power for, but were purchased in order to sell it to them. So it's less work, and they're given more money through the function of earmarks and other money laundering schemes, which allows them the latitude to engage in many of these subversions against the United States, where they ignore their function because the agreement then becomes Confederate interest over Republic interest. At the engagement of that negotiation, the executive agrees to not enforce the particulars against the interest, at which point, when the order comes from the judiciary to engage in checks and balances, the action of the executive ignoring the order or threatening to ignore the order of the judges, which are legally in a position of authority over them, to give the order at the subversion and obstruction and dismantling of the illegal legislation, qualifies their ability to have put all of the blocks in the system to prevent the active movement and normalization of the automated function of how the government was designed by law, qualifying the complete ignoring and contempt against the legal system, including the functionality of the rule of law as a functioning construct, the action of their autocratic insurrections. It actively engages in these subversions through the parallel government loyal to the Confederacy, at which point you have the loyalties to the Confederate Constitution, which is the only real law that they respect, which is their law of magic, in the subversion against the United States in the action of international extortions, such as their use of their Northwood project to do 9/11 and engage in the War on Terror, which satisfies their wish list of powers and wars, which were discovered to be fraudulent. Now, the action of engaging the list of war interest to expand into different countries where there wasn't a legal justification was supposed to be prohibited by the function of the legislator having to give the declaration of war, which is subverted in favor of the executive arrangement discussed previously, qualifying the absolute authority of kings certified for the diverse nobility inside the executive function, which many, such as Trey Gowdy, have certified the interest of engaging of government as sovereign in that function of the executive action as a noble class system, qualifying their permanent reproduction. Having engaged in the action of protecting for voter fraud, they qualify their access to the nobility on the basis of having been certified by the Confederacy, which is reoccurring functions as a consistent enforcement of their noble class on the basis of their heredity or group approved function. So the wizards loyal to the KKK as militia under the Confederacy are the ones electing the leaders, qualifying the consistent actions of Congress not being representative of the general public, which it does not represent, at service to the Confederate insurrection, qualifying their access to the spread of this throughout all power centers in the government, in the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, until the complete system collapses, at which point they exponentially increase frauds such as economic extortions for their earmarks and extortion rackets, qualifying the mass ingestion of the change of money from the general public to the select few wizard actions, qualifying the exponential increase of the black market function protected by military actions. The military covert function qualifies the economic terrorism as a layer above KKK terrorism, at which point you have the slightly more legitimate but still entirely criminal action of the economic terrorism from the economic hitmen, which are engaged in social engineering, hate crimes against the cultures targeted, as well as economic change by wizard communism. The action of the voter fraud certifying the permanent noble class qualifies a feudalist structure where you have the various fiefdoms of all insurgent actions inside of the overarching Confederacy, qualifies their act of tit for tat with inside the system, trading on the black market, which is their only real source of collaborating on tracking true value through the mechanism of compared power, which is based upon how compromised anyone is in particular. Thus, those who are of higher power have to be more compromised, and those of less power are less compromised based upon what they're able to afford. It becomes compulsory that they are compromised to X degree, where X qualifies how much power they have inside the Confederate wizard system, certifying their ability to actively maintain the exchange on the crime market nationally and internationally, including the function of Lindsey Graham's character, which has been exponentially ramping up the investment into American science for military actions, which would then be sold to prospect enemies of the United States, such as the Russians having acquired nukes, engaging in the rebalancing of the international affairs, systematically generating the action of the extortion racket from the construct of the arms race, which is the active investment into the espionage, the active investment into the weaponry, qualifying these massive ramping ups with the earmarks qualifies their collection of small portions of each of the bills of the generated revenue compounding exponentially year after year, at which point you have these high tension periods where you have these high generated quantities of returns for those who sign for them, qualifying a large insurance fraud mechanism, encouraging them to engage in the use of ignoring the congressional obligation to declare war in favor of the executive action through secret functions, subversion not loyal to the president, to be the one engaging in the declarations of war, at which point you have the active finger on the pulse of these extortion rackets of the larger war machine, qualifying the military industrial complex as separating itself from the American function into the Confederacy function. And while many of it would be completely legitimate, much of it would actively be disloyal to the Republic and loyal to the Confederacy in order to engage in larger military actions against American will, including the use of the sending of military force against civilians in secret and in broad, at which point you have some functions, I believe it's JSOC, which have been practicing the act of overthrowing the civilian population, qualifying the active normalizing of the military-industrial complexes, unrestrained Confederate loyalties, certifying the permanent wizard subjects against the general public, at which point you have the mechanisms of the political identity mechanism, which has generated the full division of political identities and boxes throughout the country, qualifying the systematic traps for each group, qualifying the traps being on a reoccurring negative downtrodden position, qualifying those traps being actively enforced for permanent reconstruction of the United States, for the wizard court's secret verdict of their new status in the general society, whether they are arranged for genocide, whether they are arranged for slavery, or whether they are arranged for lower class, middle class, or noble class, at which point you have the permanent noble class qualifying their reentry into feudalist mechanisms for the wizards, at which point you have a permanent wizard heredity mechanism of nobles qualifying the Confederates' successful coup against these United States, certifying the exponential threat against the United States and its allies and all other forms, including the functionality of their war in Ukraine as a proxy war with Russia, which only exists because of their obstruction of David Bull's character, qualifying his ability to have stopped the conflict or the assumption of the conflict in favor of the threats conducted by the Confederate wizards, engaging in the threats against the Russians, qualifying Russia's retaliation against the threat by the Confederate wizards, at which point the United States collapsing into the Confederacy, which is a trap for the Russians, qualifies exponential ramped up threats against the Russians for hotter wars against them and many of the others, qualifying international unstable conditions for the manufacture of the reproduction of revelations in their general conditions, at which point you have serious contingencies and backups and subversions which have actively been manufactured for these Satanists, which have actively pursued their criminal worship of evil for its own sake and without cause.